Joining me for all that chat, I'm delighted to say, regularly on a Tuesday, it's Tom Slater, editor of Spiked Online. A very good morning to you.
Morning, Julia.
Thank you very much for joining us. Question, as we're putting to our audience. What should Britain do about the threat from China after this spy, H6 as he was known as, expelled from the country last year, banned from returning? He was exposed, apparently at his own request. The court dropped the ruling, even though it was his request that he wasn't named here, as Yang Tengbo, a guy who was absolutely at the heart of pretty much everything Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, was doing to try and raise money for himself. Who are we kidding? Even the Prince, the pitch at the palace where he takes 2% of any deals that are done. This ain't philanthropy, folks. This is Prince Andrew filling his boots. But what should we do about the spying?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's clear that whatever process is supposed to be in place to keep tabs on people who, whilst maybe not declaring that they are serving the interests of a foreign government...
Do people do that when they arrive in the country? Hello, I'm serving the interests of the Chinese, a hostile government. Would they be? Is that something you fill out on a form?
Well, that's the nature of these things, because when the previous government passed legislation to try and sort of tighten up the rules around kind of people registering when they are essentially representatives, it's quite clear that if someone's only operating on an entirely legitimate basis, those people will obviously come forward. Everyone else, the whole point is that they go undetected. So the question is, how do you detect those people? How do you make sure that there isn't so many people that they can so readily exploit? And are there quick and clear-cut mechanisms to deal with these people, to keep them out of the country when they are rumbled? This gentleman had been essentially hanging around quite high-level political and also royal circles for a very long time.
20 years.
Photos of him with, various former prime ministers.
Prime ministers, various royals. Yeah.
Much of this does seem to sort of coincide with that supposed golden age of China relations heralded under David Cameron. So all of that is really important to tackle on a kind of fundamental level, because it doesn't matter if it's China or any other hostile to slightly more complicated relationship as we do with China, the sort of nation that you're talking about. You can't have a situation where you're lackadaisical or have terrible measures in place to deal with people when they try to get it.
The difficult thing is, it's very different from, say, dealing with Russia. For a start, huge amounts of trade goes on with China, huge amount of investment from Chinese companies. By the way, they make money when they do that. Ain't that the goodness of their heart? But also, crucially, we're not, engaged in any sort of warfare with China at the current time, but they are engaged in non-stop cyber attacks on us, non-stop cyber espionage, stealing from academic, scientific developments and technological developments from companies, from academia, spying on our political system, our economic system. I mean, they are a hostile nation state run by a murderous tyrant. I do think people need to stop treating China as if it's a normal country. It's a danger, it's a threat to our way of life. In the same way we talk about, Islamic State. Yes, they want us all to die. They think that we should all be converted to live under their rules or we die. Those are the two options. China pretty much wants the same thing. Different kind of ruling, different kind of world it would be, but that's what they want. They are a threat to our way of life, to our values, to the West, to our freedoms. And anyone who doesn't get that, frankly, ain't paying enough attention, in my view. But we're much more clear-cut about the Russian threat. Oh, you roll tanks into Ukraine. OK, right, you get sanctioned. Russians can't come to this country freely. We're not buying their oil. I mean, we just buy it once it's sold to India, then we buy it from India. Crazy, that needs to stop. But China, we're just sort of, on our knees, sort of begging them, oh, please, some more money. I worry that they are already, they've taken over academia, the amount of money that they throw. We've got the same thing with Middle Eastern oil states as well. They throw money at sport and whitewash themselves. The Chinese doing the same thing. They've done it across South America, against Africa, the Caribbean. They just throw a load of money, a load of investment, and then they sort of call in debts, and then they use this as a way of having a hold over people. I am very, very worried that a huge part of our establishment in this country is bought and paid for by the Chinese. They don't realise it. I'm not saying they're having secret clandestine meetings on benches in St James's Park and go, yes, I'm going to betray my country. I think there is so much money being peddled about that they don't even realise it.
Well, I think the thing about China is the fact that whilst it might not be engaged in kind of hot war with the West, I don't think it's necessarily a case that this is a sort of product of us being overwhelmed by this rising global hegemony. It's got certain interests and it's keen to pursue them, and I think it's been very effective at exploiting Western weaknesses, even a willingness to, rather than say, to constantly kind of outsource building your infrastructure to a foreign country. That's always going to put you in a perilous position, particularly when it's dictatorship.
Just sell off everything.
And similarly, the questions of the amount of influence it's managed to exert across the world, which has left Western powers feeling slightly less, more diminished influence in certain parts of the world. That's because they did what many Western countries didn't do, is that they go to places in Africa and say, rather than give you lectures and build you compost toilets, we're going to build you roads and hospitals. So there are lessons to be learned from this. And it's quite clear that, of course, you need to deal with China with no illusions. People will have to deal with China. It is the rising superpower. But at the same time, having a look in the mirror and trying to recognise what advantages they have taken is often because of our own missteps and weaknesses.
Yes, it's our own failures, absolutely. Well, Keir Starmer has been accused of sort of, basically getting too close to China, and particularly there are concerns over this big new super Chinese embassy near the Tower of London, where basically they want to have this epic, huge big block, which would be effectively Chinese territory inside the heart of London, in the heart of the city of London. And it's been rejected by the local council. Keir Starmer, after a conversation with Xi Jinping, calls it in. Now, calls it in means basically the government's going to make the decision. Why would you need to do that unless you were going to override it? We're already seeing that power behind the scenes, these conversations behind the scenes happening that could have an impact. There's a big concern about the Chinese being able to do that. But he's basically been told, he should sort of toughen his stance on China. He's defended fostering closer ties. He's admitted he was concerned about the challenge posed by China, but doubled down on his policy, he says, of engagement and cooperating with the state. There is this really big thing about not offending the Chinese. Well, you know what, calling them out for imprisoning 1 million Uyghur people. All these people who are so concerned about the Palestinian people, they all care about Muslims in Gaza, yet Muslims in China, not so much.
And this particular government, because it has doubled down on the net zero agenda, which, as everyone knows, because of what a big player China has become in that whole kind of renewable energy, electric cars sort of pipeline, if you like, that there is an even greater incentive for them to be slightly less forthcoming with those criticisms than even the previous government, which also tried to maintain a kind of fudge position rather than take any particular stand on a lot of these issues.
Absolutely. In terms of other international news, what do you make of this bomb that's killed a Russian general, Igor Kirillov? He's basically in charge of nuclear protection, nuclear defence in Moscow. He's died the day after he was charged with basically crimes involving using weaponry in Ukraine. He looks exactly, by the way, like if you're going to go, give me a picture of a Russian general. Yep. That's him, that's Igor. Obviously, the Ukrainians will find the fingers pointed at them. Look, they're at war with Russia, as far as I'm concerned. Military figures always justifiable, but there's no doubt at all there will be repercussions for Ukrainians here. And we've already seen, of course, the big developments in the last few weeks in terms of Trump saying, he wants to basically, put everyone around the table, and we are heading towards the end game of that war, it would appear.
No, absolutely, and I think that's why we're seeing probably an acceleration of certain plans, certain planned assassinations, certain planned military actions, which are now going to probably accelerate in the final few weeks, and it is the final few weeks really before the facts on the ground are going to fundamentally change by Trump coming to the White House. There's still a big question as to what ending the war looks like from a sort of Trumpist perspective, but it's clear that that's his intention. So there's a kind of sense of let's extract as much benefit, let's get ourselves in a stronger position, let's also just mete out plans that we'd already had in the pipeline but hadn't quite got to executing yet, quite literally in this instance. I think we're going to see more of that probably in the coming weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, let's bring things closer to home. One of the things I wanted when I voted for Brexit in 2016 was to make sure that justice happened closer to home. I don't feel the need for any court to be higher than the highest court in my own land, where judges are appointed in a system. I mean, not entirely sure I'm very happy with the way judges are appointed, but at least it's not some random judge appointed by, I don't know, someone in Poland. But Number 10 has refused to rule out accepting the European Court of Justice's jurisdiction in some specific areas as part of an improved relationship with Brussels, as part of the reset. Basically, turning us to the jurisdiction of the court for the first time since Brexit could be a key part of resetting our relationship. Now, that has got to be a red line, hasn't it? Because a key part of us voting for Brexit meant, you're coming out of the customs union, you're coming out of the European Court of Justice, you're coming out of freedom of movement, and I mean that's literally the whole point, isn't it?
Absolutely, and you would think that this government had more sense than to try and reopen these questions.
Really? Have you seen this government for the last 5 months?
The way they're trying to do it is also incredibly sneaky. So they have been essentially trying to, as what they would call kind of depoliticise Brexit, which is what they mean, try to reverse it, but very quietly behind the scenes, passing legislation that would give them powers to align us closer with EU rules, now reopening the question of European Court of Justice jurisdiction. This is obviously the direction of travel. And it's... They're
a bit sodding brave about doing this, given where they are in the polls, given the mandate they don't have in terms of percentage of the electorate who voted for them. Yes, they've got the MPs, no doubt, it's a completely democratically elected government, but they don't have a mandate for this. This is just their own personal mission, isn't it?
No, absolutely. I mean, they went into the election just saying we need a few agreements around the edges, we need a veterinary agreement.
Of course we won't backtrack on Brexit.
We just need to polish what we've got as much as possible and then move on. And yet we all knew that wasn't going to be left at that, because this is what they believe in. Keir Starmer is a legalist. He believes in kind of these international, unaccountable institutions. He thinks that's the best way in which politics is done.
Well,
that's
can't
the
trust
one
the
through line
voters.
of what he has.
You can't trust the voters.
Absolutely.
They vote for things you don't agree with sometimes.
He's the quintessence of that kind of worldview, and I think it's natural that he's going to reopen all of these different questions.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Do get in touch on this. How would you feel about us being, we talked about it as well on the show yesterday, but this, Brexit being undermined by the back door, depoliticising it, i.e. Completely, as John says, undermining it, going back into the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. It's not a British court. I don't see why it has any jurisdiction over us. I mean, full stop, end of. We're not in the EU. Last time I looked, we might be by the end of this 5-year term of Labour government. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Is that a red line for you? Or do you think that Labour's got a mandate for that? Because they were very clear that, they've always thought that we should have closer ties with Europe. How close exactly? Do give us a call. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. That's 0344 499 1000 as well. Let's also talk about Nigel Farage, linked, of course, to Brexit, as always. He's criticised, quite rightly, two-tiered justice after the OnlyFans model tart. I mean, I'm sorry, you're not a model because you get your boobs out for random men online. That doesn't make you a model, darling. You're not on a catwalk, sweetheart. But this OnlyFans model, Victoria, I really don't like this woman. I can't express how much I don't like this woman. Victoria Thomas Bowen, she's the one who threw that banana milkshake out over him, didn't get a jail sentence. Now, should one necessarily get a jail sentence for that? That's the question mark. There's a lot of discretion that judges have. But bearing in mind that, this was an unprovoked attack, this was an attack on a politician, a lot of people pointing out, and I think people are right to say, this is an attack on our democracy. You can't attack politicians going out and about campaigning in an election, because just in the same way the Southport riots, there was an argument, certainly the people who were actually involved in the riots, not the people sending tweets, but the people involved in the actual riots, you need to send a message. No, not going to happen. OK. Why is that message, given that we've had 2 MPs stabbed to death, for God's sake, why is that not a message being sent out at this point, that you cannot throw stuff at political candidates?
There is a very real danger here that it becomes sort of open season, and also if it becomes a sense that it's open season on certain kinds of politicians. Because that's the other thing about this case. Because as you say, there's a debate that could be had about how harsh a punishment should be, what is the right measure, what is a kind of analogous case that we could look to and see what we can measure it against. But then, not least because the particular district judge in this case, Tan Ikram, has been previously accused, accusations I'm sure that he would have firmly rebuff, of some level of political bias. He famously locked up a police officer for sharing racist, disgusting jokes on WhatsApp.
But private WhatsApp groups. But he spared the famous paraglider girls, the supposedly pro-Palestine protesters who had the paraglider pro-Hamas stickers on their backs. He spared them jail. Well, he said you crossed the line, but it would have been fair to say that emotions ran very high on this issue. Yes, they were celebrating people, terrorists, murderers and rapists coming into a music festival, murdering and butchering and raping people and taking... but emotions ran very high. Yeah, so it was absolutely OK, apparently.
You can celebrate racism in public, just not in private, seems to be the...
But that, exactly.
The summary of what he's saying there. And it has led to questions about whether or not, if he's willing to practice kind of two-tier justice in this case, would the same apply in this case? So,
well, exactly. But also, he extraordinarily... I mean, He didn't send to jail that time, but there definitely seems to be put it this way, a political slant to his views. Sarah Jane Baker, a man who identifies as a trans woman, he was actually out on licence while serving a life sentence for attempted murder, kidnapping and torture. Lovely man. Last August, Ikram heard his case in which Baker had told an audience of trans activists in London, if you see a TERF, punch them in the effing face. This judge ruled that that was not criminal speech. So a private message, okay, even a racist, sexist, homophobic, horrible, nasty message sent in private in a WhatsApp group, that is unacceptable. But celebrating a massacre of Jews, talking about punching women, a man talking about punching women in the face, that's not hate speech. This man has some serious issues as far as I'm concerned, but he is fully and utterly on board with this whole sort of diversity, DEI culture, isn't he? I mean, which is where our judges are now. So if you think you're going to go to court to get a bit of quiet sanity, judges are no longer representing. You can't become a judge. He's the guy on the board of the judges who agree other judges. You can't become a judge unless you sign up to this madness. That's what's going on. Again, that ideology, critical race theory, trans ideology, I would say also anti-Semitism, because that is a crucial part of the DEI. It is part of it now. That is absolutely infected every part of our establishment, including our courts, which is a terrible thing. But there's no doubt at all. I mean, I can live with her not going to jail, but people writing tweets would go to jail. And that is where we've got two-tier justice. And you know perfectly well, if she had milkshaked, a Labour candidate, there's no doubt at all in my mind that she would have gone to jail. But because it was Nigel Farage, he's fair game, which is that tells you everything about what's going on in our courts today.
And the longer it goes on, the longer it is going to feel like it is open season. That wasn't the only assault on him that took place during that election campaign. Also, people throwing bits of brick and so on. This is something which is going to continue the more that there isn't clear-cut justice, but also clear-cut condemnation and not two-tier outrage, depending on which politician is being assaulted.
Absolutely.